Hello, everyone, and welcome to Intimacy with the World podcast. I am Dorita Holm, your host on this show, where we explore what really matters to live a meaningful life. Today, I am speaking with Micah Mortali, who is the author of the book Rewilding: Meditations, Practices, and Skills for Awakening in Nature. Micah's life's work is reconnecting modern people with the restorative powers of nature through mindfulness in the great outdoors. Micah is the founder of the groundbreaking Kripalu School of Mindful Outdoor Leadership. And Micah is also himself a yoga teacher, and he leads trainings, corporate events, wilderness retreats, and seminars on rewilding and mindful outdoor leadership at Kripalu and across New England in America. He lives in the Berkshire Hills of Western Massachusetts with his family. So Micah, welcome to Intimacy with the World podcast. I am so honored to be speaking with you. I've been reading your book and it touched me deeply. It's probably one of the themes that most interests me in the whole world, is connecting to nature. So this theme of rewilding, this very domesticated sense of selves that most of us have, rewilding it, and we have ended up so domesticated through our modern lives, is something that I'm even teaching on in February in an online course called Mindfulness and Inner Wildness, about exploring our true self through intimacy with nature. So I want to start with a quote from your book. You say that rewilding is a return to our essential nature. It is an attempt to reclaim something of what we were before we used words like civilized to define ourselves. So to you, you also say that rewilding is coming home to our roots. It is a recognition that this planet and our local environment are priceless gifts from the forces of life in our universe. So can you please tell us why you think that it is so fundamental for today's humans to reconnect with nature and perhaps even the wild nature within ourselves?
Yeah, well, first off, let me just say thanks for having me on the show, Drita, and I'm really happy to be here and talk to your audience. So hello, everyone. I think what it comes down to for me is that modern life has dramatically altered the way that we live. And the modern human being at this point is an indoor being. We spend the vast majority of our lives indoors, most modern humans. And technology has dramatically altered our day-to-day life. The modern American spends at least 11 hours a day on a screen. So when we think about the history of human beings on this planet, and there's a lot we know and there's a lot we don't know about our past as a species. So if we go back more than about 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 years, like we don't really know that much about what we were up to. But we know that for the most part, we were outside and we were connected, I would say, with seasonal rhythms, with the plants and the animals and the geography and the geology of the lands that our ancestors were living on. So our senses are all of our senses and capacities as a species, the five senses and beyond the five senses, existed in a dynamic relationship with the environment. So, people who were living on the Faroe Islands or in the North Atlantic had a dynamic, and hopefully still to some extent had a dynamic relationship with the ocean and the volcanic activity of those lands, and the food sources that were available in those areas. And same here. I live on land that is ancestral Mohican land. So the Mohican people are the people who are most recently indigenous to the place where I live. And so people who are living here had these profound relationships with um, the lakes and the streams and the rivers and the seasons and the mountains and the hills and the food sources that were here. Um, so when I talk about rewilding, I'm not talking about a wildness that is out of control. I'm not talking about a wildness, that is inhumane. I'm talking about a wildness that is more like a way of being deeply alive, a sense of being fully alive. And my experience has been that, 11 hours a day on a screen and plus 90% of life spent indoors diminishes our sense of being alive. It takes away from really what is, the awe factor, the wonder of, being, just being alive on planet Earth, where, we're on this little, very, very alive little globe that's, hurtling through space. It's all very mysterious and to me, very miraculous. And I think that's where the mindfulness piece comes in, is that, the more we can slow down and just be present for where we are and what we're doing. In my experience, and in the experience of I think a lot of people who practice mindfulness, there is an increase in a sense of wonder, at just the simple little beautiful things that are happening around us at any given moment. And I think that's sort of the hidden jewel of the rewilding sort of practice, is that nature is, incredibly beautiful. And I think people are longing for a sense of that beauty, that inner beauty and that outer beauty, and the mystery and the wonder of the fact that we're alive on Earth, and we really don't know how we got here. There's a lot that we don't know, and that's cool, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Let us never know how it all happened. Let's keep the wonder and the mystery alive.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So that brings me to ask you, you write about, and this was, I don't think I'd heard this before, and it made such a deep impact on me. You write about a life force deficit. And I found this so interesting. I mean, isn't the life force just there, flowing through everyone who's alive? How can we have a deficit in life force?
Right. So, yeah.
I know we can, but I want you to explain.
Yeah. Yeah. So, well, of course, in yoga and in Tai Chi and different contemplative and embodied practices, back in the day before modern science, there was an idea of there being a life force, whether you refer to it as prana or chi or ki or the Holy Spirit or Great Spirit, whatever it might be. Ancient people, our ancestors, definitely had a concept of there being a life force. I grew up very much on the mythology of Star Wars. And there's this idea of the Force, right, in Star Wars. And George Lucas didn't come up with that. It's very much part of our human, it's part of our human experience, this idea of life force. And many traditions talk about the fact that life force is abundant in natural places, right? By waterfalls, by the ocean and forests. This idea that we feel more alive, that we have more vitality, more vigor when we are, immersed in these places. And I think most people can subjectively attest to the fact that when you go to the beach for a week in the summer for vacation, you sit by the ocean. I mean, who doesn't feel so much better, so much more alive, right? Or, if, maybe you like forest bathing and just spending that time among the standing people, the trees, and feeling more vital, more alive. So, this is just a term that I came up with because in my own experience, I had a period where I dove very deep into the hatha yoga practices when I was a resident at Kripalu. And, my experience was that during those years when I was doing, a few hours of yoga practice a day, and I was really doing a lot of the pranayamas, the yogic breathing practices, and really cultivating a relationship with prana, life force, that, after I would do those practices in the building where I would, very much be going inside, very much cultivating a sense of relationship with my breath, that when I would walk outside into the forest, it was as if my senses were so attuned and so awakened that walking into the forest was overwhelming.
Yeah. So
It was
so
overwhelming. Yeah.
yeah. So do you actually think that, when we're enclosed by brick walls and cement walls, and we're enclosed in this box that we are when we are in houses, do you think that the life force, I mean, the force that makes an acorn lie on the ground there, and it's just a small acorn, and before we know it, it's a big oak tree. I mean, we don't even know what that kind of mystery is that makes the acorn into a big oak tree. Do you think that that force that can make the acorn grow into a big oak tree is somehow hindered by the brick walls when we're enclosed in a box?
It's a great question. I think about it this way. I think about it like, as human beings, we evolved in contact with the elements. So we evolved as a species, or for maybe another way to put it is, for the vast majority of our time as human beings, we existed in a dynamic relationship with the elements. So when we remove ourselves, like when we put ourselves in a temperature controlled box, let's right. I think it's similar to what happens when you take an animal like a gorilla, let's say, out of its environment in the forest, in the Congo, and you put it in a cement area at a zoo, right? And what we do know is that many wild animals, when they're put in confinement in zoos, have physical and mental health problems, right? So we're animals. So if you take human beings and you remove them from their natural habitat, and then you have them sit in these artificial environments, we also have physical and mental health problems as a result of that. So I think it's really just a matter of being taken out of our natural habitat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You say that how awakening this authentic spiritual connection with the natural world is actually a coming home to our true self. So why do you think that this nature connected self is more true than a sense of self that has no relationship whatsoever to the natural world? I mean, we have this amazing, as humans, consciousness that can build computers and smartphones and so on. Why do you think that the other self that connects to the nature is more true than the self that connects to a computer?
Well, I guess the way I look at it is that the only way that we can exist as a species is in a situation where our planet is healthy and biodiverse and vibrant. The only way we can really maximize our potential is if the planet is taken care of, right? If we have to have clean, pure water and clean air, and our food really needs to be healthy and clean and pure. And so if we're living in a world where we're cut off from the planet, and we're out of balance, let's say, with our, I'm not anti-technology, but if we allow our relationship with technology to become dominant, and we live in these cut off environments where we're living in an illusion that we can exist cut off from the forces of nature, and that's all an illusion, because we can't, right? Long term, it's not sustainable. And if we ignore our responsibility to be stewards of the environment, then eventually, as all the indigenous cultures have predicted and prophesied, eventually that karma is going to catch up with us, and we're going to find ourselves in a bad spot, right? So So it's a balance, and Richard Louv, who I, respect so much, wrote the book, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder. He basically says in one of his books that, we need a balance between technology and nature, that, for every hour we spend on a screen, we should do an hour walking outside or looking out the window. And I think there is a balance here, and I also wonder, like we're going through this time right now on our planet where, maybe we're going through one of these cyclical times of great transition that happen on our, I tend to think that we go through these cycles of change on the planet. Um, we happen to be going through one of these profound times of transformation. And, one of the things that I wonder about is if we can turn to nature, if we can turn to the way that things move in the natural world, to the cycles and the rhythms of things, if perhaps, nature, the universe can inspire us to problem solve our current situation in ways that are going to be more in harmony with the way things want to be moving. Um, so, and that means maybe our technology can be more inspired by how nature works, as opposed to, an approach to technology that's very much, kind of man over nature.
Yeah.
Perhaps there's technologies which are here right now of really working with the earth and the cycle. So
Yeah. My house is 100% solar paneled.
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Good for you.
Yeah. In effect, you actually invite us all in your book to shed the effects of over civilization and to explore an inner wisdom that you say is primal, ancient, and profound. But how do you know that our primal, ancient wisdom is really appropriate today? I mean, haven't we moved past that? We live in a different, more evolved world now, technological world. Do you think that that primal wisdom has anything to offer us today?
Well, I don't know if I don't know if I think we've evolved past our ancestors. I think our societies and our cultures perhaps um, have moved down certain pathways that have brought us to where we are, technologically. But I wouldn't necessarily think we've evolved as a species really, or changed that much. Um, you know, I guess I would look at it like, our society as it stands now. There's certain things that we've been able to do. We've been able to go to the moon. We've been able to, develop, technology that allows us to produce a lot of food and feed a lot of people, and medicine and all of these things. So there's a lot of really cool stuff that, we've been able to do. And yet at the same time, I think if you look at modern people, we're not a happy bunch.
Exactly.
Modern, we're, I mean, that's got to be an important measurement for success, right? Is, we've done all this stuff, we've gone to the moon, and but are we happy? Our modern, if you ask a modern person, are you happy? Do you think that things are going well overall? With the human experiment on this planet, I think most people would say, eh, right? Um, so again, I think that there is a balance. If we go back, so my ancestors, as far as I know, came from Europe, Italy, and England, and Ireland, to a certain extent, and then further back to other parts, and then ultimately back to Africa. Um, you know, I'm very curious about what it was like for my ancestors who lived in, let's say, sort of England and Scotland and, those parts of Europe, um, before the Roman Empire. I had ancestry, and we all did, who were indigenous, who were hunter gatherers, who
Yeah.
lived close to the earth, and who revered the forces of nature. I've been researching lately more about my Celtic roots, and been very, nourished by learning about, the Oak King and the Holly King and the goddess, and the seasonal holidays, and um, in particular, like the antlered man, the spirit of the forest. Um, my ancestors had a deep relationship with the deer, and the deer were a primal food source, for them, as they were for so many indigenous cultures here in North America.
Mm.
Um, and what I've found through my own practice of rewilding has been that, as I begin to learn more about the ways that my ancestors lived, birthing fire, through friction, um, animal tracking, building shelters, slowing down, being quiet, watching the movement of the seasons, that, these practices are profound, that there is something there in the way that our ancestors related to the natural world. There was an intimacy, there was a reciprocity, um, and there was a nourishment there that is still very relevant today.
Yeah.
At least in my experience, and in the people that I work with and that I share this information with, and the people who have shared it with me, there is something there that's very relevant. And I think it's an individual practice. It's sort of an inquiry. It's a journey that somebody feels compelled to go down. Um, and I think it's going to be different for different people, like different aspects of what those ancestral practices might be. For some people, it might be foraging for wild herbs. For other people, it might be, weaving. For other people, it might be, hunting and gathering, whatever it might be. Um, I think that like a mindfulness practice, like a spiritual practice, um, it's something that different folks are going to feel, called to explore in different ways. Um, but I have found in my own experience that those moments that I have out there on the land, when I devote the time to slowing down and to being open to what the land has to offer, that those moments can be absolutely profound and life changing. I'm so grateful for the time I've had on the land. So,
Yeah, I love what you said about that when you are uh, physically, like tangibly in contact with nature like that, and you give it your full attention, you open to it, that it nourishes something inside you, like you come into contact with something that's essential to being a human, no, to being in contact with the rest of life in a tangible way, for real.
mhm,
Yeah.
yeah.
um you do, I cannot do this interview, of course, without mentioning that you quote Luther Standing Bear, and he says, he's from of the, was it the Lakota people?
Yeah.
Yeah, and you write, you quote him: "A lack of respect for green growing things soon leads to a lack of respect for people too." So can you expand on this for us, on why you think there is a correlation between the two, between the lack of respect for green growing things and the lack of respect for people?
Yeah. Yeah, I love that quote. It's one I came across back in my early 20s and just have been reflecting on for a really long time. Um, yeah, I think what Luther Standing Bear was getting at there, was this idea of, what I've found is that in all my research of hunting and gathering cultures, that there is an ethic of thanksgiving or gratitude that's central to those ways of being, um, and living. And, what it comes down to is that when we are participating in the process of where our food comes from, that, um, when we are taking life ourselves, that um, there is a sense of grief. There is a sense of, I don't want to necessarily use the word guilt, but there is a sense of, I'm taking life and I'm aware of the fact that I'm taking life in order to live. Um, with that, of course, comes, when we're very much enmeshed in our environment, that we realize as well that we also are going to be consumed at some point by other life forms on the planet. Whether, when we're buried and, we become part of the soil, and then we become part of the plants. and then the animals are going to eat those plants. And so in essence, part of our energy then becomes part of the animals, right? So we are a part of, and I guess this is what I'm trying to get at in the book a lot is, we are not separate. We and one of the things that blows me away is just this idea that, as a species, we in some ways, we evolved right up out of the stuff of the universe. Like, how crazy is that? That we with that fact that we can self-reflect, that we can think about our thoughts, that we can really reflect on this, the mystery of the universe. How did that happen? Like, that is unbelievable. That's amazing, right? I think it's that's one of the great, most amazing things to think about is how does that happen?
Yeah, and what's the point of that?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And so, for us to be out there on the land and to be, participating in that process, if we become cut off from that process, if we, like we are today, many people, especially now in COVID, right? It's interesting. We can sit in our apartments on Netflix and we can order our food. Somebody will bring it all to us in boxes. It just appears. And we are not connected to, oh, okay, I'm eating a hamburger. That was a cow. Somebody had to kill that cow. Somebody had to butcher that cow, right? Or I'm eating a tomato. Somebody had to tend that and grow that, all that. When we lose a sense of awe, when we lose a sense of wonder at a tomato, we can take that tomato for granted. And if we can take a tomato for granted, then we can take a person for granted. We can sort of, just kind of look over the fact that there was that nice person who, drove that food to our doorstep. And so there's a way in which those relationships and that sense of reciprocity, that sense of that we are connected, can
Yeah.
break down. And I think when all of that starts to break down, it becomes much easier for us to lose track of our responsibility as caretakers.
Yeah, so we lose
Yeah.
something inherent that can be inherent in us, this this connectedness with the earth and each other and everything. And when we lose that, we lose something very essential in ourselves, even if but a tomato, why is that important to feel gratitude to a tomato? Well, it's connected to something deeper in your view, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you, Luther Standing Bear, also said that men's heart away from nature becomes cold and hard. So that men's heart away from nature becomes cold and hard. So how do we even notice if our hearts have started to become cold and hard? It can happen without us even noticing it happening. So what do you think are some of the signs that we are not as open and warm-hearted as we could be?
Mm. Yeah, it's a great question. Um, well, a lack of compassion, I think, um, is a good sign. I think that idea that our hearts can become, cold and hard. A good example of that would be Darth Vader in Star Wars, right? So part of what I love about that story is, what Darth Vader represents, which is kind of a human being who's become totally technological, wrapped in machines, of sort of everything around Darth Vader in that story is like he's not in nature, right? He's in all these gray artificial environments. He's wrapped up in um, and so if you think about today, a lot of people go around with their noise canceling earbuds in. We walk around, when we're in a public place, we sit down, we, instead of looking at people, we go on our phones, right? We're looking at that, looking at the news. And we kind of, it's easy for us to cut ourselves off from those around us. And I think the danger in that is that we start to feel disconnected. And I think when we feel disconnected, that's when we start to feel cold and hard. That's when we start to feel, I think there's a lot of feelings that can come with that, whether it's just feeling hopeless or sad, depressed or jaded or um, cynical. Um, and it's so easy to feel all those feelings today, especially, if we spend a lot of time just like reading the news or focusing on, negative information. It's very easy to feel those ways. So, what I encourage people to do is, just be very aware of their consumption of mass media, and to make sure that every day you take some time to, go outside and sit with the earth, and make that a priority,
Yeah.
because most of the time we're going to start to feel better if we take a little bit of time to look out the window and just be, right, just practice being present, watching the wind blow through the trees, watching the waves at the ocean, watching the birds, listening to the sounds of the earth, and just taking that time to be open and to listen. Um,
Yeah.
it's so important, today. We people really desperately need that,
Mm.
right?
I think that for a lot of people, it has to be a relearning, because it's
Yeah,
not what, yeah. I
I
decided,
agree.
I decided many years ago, because I'm out every day for minimum 1 hour, either running in the mountains or the forest, or with the dogs. Well, I also run with the dogs, but sometimes I walk with the dogs every single day. And I took a decision many years ago, never ever with music or anything in my ears. Like, I want to be there. I want to be present
Yeah,
to the sounds that are there and to take it in. And that's one thing that I really liked about your book as well. You say that when we go out, because we all have to be outside sometimes, but we don't necessarily connect to the air or the breeze or the birds when we're outside, to take a conscious decision before we go out, that I'm going out to be present, to actually connect with and it's a fundamentally different experience if you just go out and you're lost in your own head and in your mind, than if you go out and every time you get lost, try and come back to your immediate surroundings. Can you speak about that? How this decision, and what are we to do if we are going to relearn this skill? How do we do
yeah.
this?
Oh, I love that. And that's great that you do that. And I agree. I think it's so important. So again, it comes to this like connection, this conversation about connection. When we have those earphones in, we're blocking out our environment, which, if you live in the city and you're being bombarded with so much noise, totally understand why folks would want to have that. But you're right. It makes a big difference when we go for a walk outside and we set that strong intention that this time that I'm about to spend right now is a time of connection. And having that intention transforms what follows. It transforms the experience, because rather than getting lost, as you said, in the stories in our minds, we're going to allow our awareness to be absorbed by what's happening around us. And that fundamentally is what forest bathing is all about. And I think it's actually the natural state of most hunter-gatherer people, is that, because here's the thing, right? Like, you can't afford, when you're living that close to the earth, when you're hunting and gathering, when you're participating in your environment that much, you can't afford to be lost in your thoughts. You actually have to be fully present for what's happening around you, right? It's a luxury to tune out like that in the environment. So when we go out with that intention, we give our senses the opportunity to, I don't know, to embrace in a powerful way the medicine that is all around us. To give our senses the opportunity to just embrace all of the sensory activity that's happening in our environment. That is medicine, for the human being, right? Whether it's, the phytoncides, like the aroma of the forest, or just like taking in that deep breath of all the aroma, you're getting that aromatherapy, boosting your immunity. If you're at the ocean, that big sense of smell of the sea, the refreshing wind moving through your hair. It's so funny. I'm reading the book Heidi to my daughter right now.
Yes.
And it's amazing. It's this wonderful story,
Yeah.
about this little girl, Clara, who grows up in Frankfurt, right? You know this story, right?
Yes,
And
in the mountains with her grandfather, right?
Heidi's up in the mountains with her grandfather, and a lot of the story is about, Heidi bringing this girl Clara, who's been in the city. shut up indoors. And, she's an invalid, she can't walk, or that's how they referred to it back then. Like, she, for whatever reason, she was unable to walk. And, through the course of coming up into the mountains, she's, her senses are awakened, like, and her whole being is vitalized by being up there. And it's this really interesting story about how transformational it can be, to rewild, as Heidi and her grandfather were living it, up there in the mountains.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you something. I remember maybe 2 years ago or so, I'd been on a one week retreat, and I was driving back home by the coast, and it was a really I'm in Spain, and it was a very windy day. The Mediterranean is often not so windy, but it was one of these really windy days. So I stopped at the beach, and there was nobody there because it was so wild, the ocean and everything. And so I'd been on 1 week silent retreat. And so I sat down and just watched the ocean for a while, and just marveling at the force and the light and how beautiful it was. And then it was like, okay, and now what? And I've experienced this also. And I mean, then I'd even been on a retreat for a week, and, I've done a lot of mountain biking in the past, and, and also a lot of walking and hiking and sleeping out in the mountains. And this feeling, I know it so well, when you come to this beautiful spot, you've climbed on your bike or walking for hours to get to the top. And then you're on the top, and it's breathtaking view, and you sit there and you take it in. And then there's like okay, and now what? Do I take a picture and send it to someone and try and get some likes? Or do I, like, this resting in just the beingness, in the beauty of the nature? Can you speak to that? I'm sure I'm not the only one.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? That now what feeling, or that now what impulse. Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I really love the sit spot practice, and I write about it in the book, and it's something that I always teach everybody that I work with, which is just the practice of just sitting in nature with most of the time with your eyes open. And, the idea is to, like, you get up to the top of that mountain, and then, rather than now what, I'm going to sit, and I'm going to take some time to just be here and connect with this place. And it's very powerful. And I think it's really where I think it's where the contemplative traditions come from. I think it's from people, sitting out and being very still, on the land. And initially, that had, there were practical reasons to do that. It probably evolved at some point into, more esoteric purposes. But, what I found is oftentimes modern people, when we want to connect with nature, what we do is say, like, oh, let's go for a hike, and you meet your friend, and get it to the trailhead. And so what's been going on with you? And then you're just walking and talking, and you're moving through the forest, but you're really not present for the place. And it's not to judge that. That's so much fun. That's great to do. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it's a very different experience to do that than to, get to the trailhead and with a friend, let's say, it's okay, let's do this in silence. Let's just connect with this place. As you said, set that intention, to just connect with this place. And, what I like to do is, go out on a walk like that. And then at some point in the walk, do a sit spot. So maybe you get to some place that feels good. Say, let's spread out. Let's sit for 20 minutes. And then you sit. And, John Young, in his book, What the Robin Knows, which is a book I'd recommend to everybody who's listening or watching. He talks about this idea that when we go to nature, or anytime we're moving on the land, that we have a choice. We can either create this big zone of disturbance, so we're, breaking twigs or talking loudly or just not being mindful. All the wildlife is going to pick up on us, and they're just going to kind of scatter and hide. Or we can, try to elevate our zone of awareness, where we walk mindfully, we slow down, we connect with our breath, we create less disturbance, and therefore we're going to be able to see more of what's normally going on out there. And when we go to our sit spot, that's the whole idea, is we're creating this big zone of awareness as we're minimizing the zone of disturbance. So we kind of get to melt into the landscape. And that can be a life-changing experience for modern people, to have that window into the world when you're actually a part of the land, as opposed to being sort of like a passer through.
Yeah, what I also like about that is that, for example, when you sit down and say, okay, now I'm gonna do my half-hour daily meditation, you sit down and you're doing something. You're like, okay, I'm gonna work with my mind. I'm gonna, but I imagine with the sit spot. I mean, I have a spot when I go with the dogs. I sit down in the same spot every single day. And I just sit, and there's no agenda. It's not like, oh, now I need to notice, now I need to do this and that. The only thing is that just don't be stuck in your head, but everything else, just let it come, just be open. So it's a very organic, very relaxed kind of practice, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely an open meditation form where, you're not focusing your mind on a single point, but you're just kind of opening your awareness to whatever is happening in the moment. So it can be effective for dropping into a flow state. As you sort of, sometimes it's referred to as fascination attention. I think I
I
mentioned
love
that in the book. Yeah, so it's the perfect antidote to just feeling burnt out after being on the screen. If you've been on a bunch of Zoom calls, during the day and you're just like feeling wiped, you know, the best thing to do is to just go outside, go for a walk, and just engage fascination attention. Just let your mind, your awareness move to whatever you find beautiful. Like, oh, watch the wind. Here's the birds. Now I'm going to look at the stream. Like whatever it is in nature, just let your attention just wander to whatever you find fascinating. And it can be like a really good recovery practice for like Zoom fatigue.
Yeah, you talk about natural mindfulness in the book, but one thing that I think you also mentioned it in the book is like when you just sit still and just try and expand your vision out to the outest, and just let it rest out at the periphery. My English is a bit maybe you'll explain it better than me.
Yeah. So owl eyes is what that's referred to oftentimes, or wide angle vision. And it is a way of seeing where you set an intention to engage your peripheral vision. So the idea is, you're aware of what's happening out here, and you're aware of the whole field of vision from your periphery, in front, and top and bottom. And it's a profound nature connection practice. And what it can do is it allows us to pick up on very, very small movements in the landscape. So when you practice owl eyes, you'll see things that you would never otherwise notice. Minute movements of insects, slight movements of wind, very, very subtle movements. You'll pick up on, just a single bird way off in the distance, just pumping its tail feathers, things that you just normally would miss, you will pick up on with owl eyes. And it's also that way of seeing where you're aware of the periphery and the whole field of vision. My experience with that has been that I can't be me while I'm doing that practice. So like, I can't be in my ego. I can't really be my person while I'm doing that. There's something that happens, at least for me and other folks I've spoken to, where you have to really step out of yourself in order to engage that practice. And it can be really powerful.
Yeah. And it's very interesting because it's not as strainful as normal mindfulness, where it's like keep on the breath. It's like so open and expansive, and it's very, very restful. I find it's like almost like you're resting outside of yourself, like you're resting in your awareness, simply, very simply, like that.
Right. Yeah. And it's not, I agree. And it's not a way of seeing that where you're using your eyes differently. It's more of an intention.
Yes.
So it's very, it's a very interesting practice, and a very powerful one. It's a great one to combine with your sit spot. So when you're doing your sit spot, to sort of practice your owl vision, your wide angle vision, and just notice, what happens there.
Yeah. Another thing that you talk about in the book is you are very, very, very fascinated about making fire in the natural ways. So not with matches and a lighter, but with what do you call it, a bowstring. And so tell us about, why is that so transformative to you, to make fire in the old ancient ways?
Yeah. Uh, yeah. So one of the techniques in the book I talk about is the bow drill and the hand drill. And I believe I talk about flint and steel
Yes, you
as
do.
well there. Yeah. So fire. Fire is such an interesting thing. Um, it's one of the earliest forms of technology that, we mastered as a species, and I really can't think of any leap in technology that was as impactful for us than the ability to master fire. So you could imagine what it must have been like for our ancestors, um, to to have to actually go and find fire, and then keep fire, carry it around, but not know how to create it, and what it must have been like for them to see that first person with the hand drill, you know making making fire. Like, that changed everything, because our ancestors lived through the last ice age. We've lived our ancestors have lived through multiple glaciations where major parts of the planet were covered in miles of ice,
Yeah.
and mega predators, dire wolves and flat-nosed brown bears. And you know it's amazing to think about the reality that our ancestors lived through, here on Earth, and what they had to contend with. Dire wolves were the size of lions and hunted in packs.
Yeah,
Um,
and humans were just in the middle of the food chain. They were like really
exactly.
beastly and indefensible. They had nothing, you know.
Yeah.
They don't
Yes.
have big teeth and big jaws.
Right. We had to use our brains, right? So you could imagine how important it was to be able to make a fire at night and have a big fire going, and that sense of security, the warmth, the light, the ability to cook our food all the time, and what an impact that had on our digestive process. To our pre-digest our food through cooking it had a huge impact on our evolution. So all of that, and fire was the way that we ended our days for hundreds of thousands of years, right? At the end of the day, we would stare into the embers of the fire. And when we do that, it puts us into a meditative state, right? We've all gazed into a campfire and just found ourselves sort of entranced, right? So I feel my sense is that fire played a very important role in the development of, the development of contemplative practice. It was the way that we wound down every day. Fire prepared us to go to sleep. Um, and if in the Rig Veda, which is like one of the oldest, maybe the oldest book written, the first word of the Rig Veda is Agni, fire. um, so fire, look, the sun is fire,
Yeah.
right? It is the source of life, is the light and the heat and the energy that comes from the sun, right, which is fire.
Yeah.
So um, fire is very important. And the process of birthing fire with friction, the first time I did it was with the bow drill, where you can look in the book the components, but basically you've got a bow, and with the bow you're spinning a spindle. It's a shaft of wood, and the pulling of the bow back and forth is spinning this spindle, and the spindle is being pressed down into a board, and the board has a little pie shape carved out of it. And that little pie shape, the wood dust that's being ground off of the hearth board and the spindle is filling that little pie hole. And as the pie hole fills up with wood dust, it's being superheated by the friction. And eventually, when the temperature gets high enough, that wood dust ignites into a little red coal. The whole process is so symbolic. There's so much going on there. Um, and to get to that point where you've got plumes of smoke coming out, and then all of a sudden, you're exhausted, you're sweating, you're fatigued, and then you stop and you remove the spindle, and there in that wedge is just this little incense like wisp of smoke coming up, and that fire is now alive. And it really feels like, when you do this practice, that you've just birthed something, right?
Yeah.
There was nothing there, and then now there is this fire that's breathing, and it's eating, it's consuming that wood dust. It's being fed by the oxygen, and it has now transformed from an inert substance now into this fire that's just going to grow and spread. It's alive, and it feels like
Yeah.
all of a sudden you've got this little life. And then you have to create a tinder, like you have to create a bird's nest out of tinder. It's like a little, it looks just like a bird's nest. And then you have to very tenderly transfer that coal into the bird's nest. And then you're holding it and you're breathing on it and you're nurturing it. And then all of a sudden, in the palm of your hand is a fire.
Yeah.
And like when I do this, like, you know, people will sometimes like weep.
Yes.
People will weep when they see it. It's
You
like,
know, it's very, very different to hear you explain it than reading it in your book. Because I could really feel what you were saying, the transformation that's taking place within your own hands, in front of your own eyes, that you're transforming something that was kind of lifeless and a stick and a board. And all of a sudden you have something so alive as a fire coming to life because of something you did.
yeah, yeah, it's a life-changing experience. Like when, you know, when I teach people how to do this practice, um, you know, one of the things that, you know, I'll never take a photo of somebody when they do their first bow drill, because, you know, I feel like that this is for you. Like when you have this experience, like your first fire, I try to tell people this isn't for anybody else. Like this is for you, because this is a profound experience. You're doing something, you're a part of something that, you know, your ancestors might have done 150,000 years ago, right? There is something just so, um, it is really, when I talk about profound things in the book, you know, birthing a fire through bow drill feels very profound,
Yeah.
because it's ineffable. It transcends language. It's something that just connects with something very mysterious, um, and it's unforgettable. Like you'll never forget that experience. And you know, it has survival implications. It's one of those things that's very empowering. Wow, I know how to do that. I can go off into the woods with just a knife and a shoelace, and I can create, you know, fire in this way. So it's got implications for that. But you know, when we talked a little bit earlier about gratitude and that ethic of Thanksgiving, you know, these practices have been passed down through different lineages for a long, long time, and it is it's more than just survival. There are, I believe that there are very deep um, teachings that are embedded in that practice, that it is a gift to receive.
So when you say that it's the first word in the Rig Veda, what does it refer to? Where is what's the mystery in the fire?
Well, you know, in the ancient culture, you know, of the Aryan culture, from that period, you know, that was the worldview there was that, like in many cultures from that time on Earth, the fire would carry the prayers up to the spiritual realms. So, you know, that's very prevalent across many cultures from that time period. This idea that the fire was the vehicle that would carry our intentions, our prayers, our offerings to the gods up into the sky. So fire was a technology that was enabled communication with the spirit world. Um,
Is there also something about the sheer, like when you burn something, like it transforms, it disappears?
Absolutely,
Like
yes,
it's
yes,
deeply transforming. It can transform a big strong tree to nothing.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And you know, in the yoga tradition, you know, the word tapas, you know, refers to it's discipline, but it's a discipline that's heating. You know, and in a lot of ways, tapas is this friction that happens when we use our will to come to a practice over and over and over again. We kind of burn through the limiting beliefs, or you know, so we burn through our karma, you know, through tapas, through friction, through will. And you know, that's certainly that's the heat of transformation that really is at the root of many, I guess I would say, like, you know, many sort of mystical contemplative traditions. There's a strong emphasis on will,
Yeah.
as at
The
least the
will is
first.
like a fire element.
Yeah, it's yeah, and it's usually the first stage of many spiritual traditions. Is, you know, the first path of the seeker is a path of will. because it is a transformational practice, and it does allow us to burn through those self-limiting beliefs that we have about ourselves.
Yeah. Oh, that's very interesting. So I'm conscious of your time. So, but this I had to put this in. You're right. The consciousness we bring to anything is the single most important determinant of our experience. If we approach the earth with fear or with a desire for conquest, our experience will be profoundly different than if we approach with reverence and respect and a desire to care and coexist. That's the whole ethos of your book, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, I think that that's been true for me. I think that our the intention that as human beings, like we can set an intention with anything that we do. And I think that the history of the United States has been one where the colonizers who came from Europe to this country had a mindset of conquest, of man over nature. This idea that we had to sort of conquer the wildness of this continent, and civilize it and make it productive. And and so we can see that, even as we start to think about leaving this planet and going to other planets, in a lot of ways we're really taking that same consciousness with us. We haven't really changed in that sense. And so that mindset profoundly affects the experience that we have. So, when, if I go out into the forest and I approach it from, all right, just from a survival standpoint, I'm just going to go out here and my goal is to just survive and to just get what I need from the environment so that I can survive. Then the consciousness there is one of lack or fear or me against, as opposed to, I'm going to head out onto this land today, and my goal is to open myself to the eternal wisdom of the living earth. And I'm going to approach my time so that the tree people and the stone people and all of my relations out here are my teachers and my guides. That's gonna create a very, very different experience.
Yeah.
So what I want to do in the book is that, I think modern people can really benefit from having skills that will allow them to survive, allow them to thrive, and allow them to feel confident. I do want people to feel like they can walk out of their homes and, they can begin a journey where they actually can have more of an engaged experience with the earth. And that does include hunting and gathering and being a part of where their food comes from, being participating in the great cycle of life. I feel like that can be a very beautiful and harmonious and positive thing. But to approach it from a place of reverence and respect and reciprocity, I think that's possible.
Yeah. And the whole point also is that if you do that, if you bring that kind of consciousness to your beingness in this world, you are the first one, and the people around you are the first ones who will benefit from it, because you will feel so much more ease in your own being. You're not going to be so anxious and frustrated and in your head. So it's a win-win.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So this is the last thing. You do say that for hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived intimately with the earth. We were in the wild and off the wild. Today we live mostly urban lives, and our vital wildness has gone dormant. And as a result, we're more isolated, unhealthy, anxious, and depressed than ever. And our planet has suffered alongside us. So you teach these practices. Do you see a growing interest? I mean, you're in America, which is you have lots of big cities and lots of urban life over there. Do you see something else waking up in people? Do you see an increase in, as we're destroying the planet, that there's more and more interest in what you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a huge interest in nature connection, that's growing here in the States, and I think around the world. And I think, one thing you can look at as an indicator, just the forest schools that are popping up all over, the forest kindergartens, the nature connection schools. There's so many programs now. Like, 20 years ago, when I first started to get into this stuff here in the United States, there was the Tom Brown Tracker School. Tom Brown really was one of the first people who began to teach ancestral skills here in the United States. But there weren't a lot of those kinds of programs. And now there are, hundreds, if not thousands of programs across the country that teach ancestral skills. Now they're all on a spectrum, some focus more on survival, others more on nature connection. But there are thousands, tens of thousands of kids who are learning these skills at, bow drill, foraging, care, wild tending and caretaking of the land. Like, there's a huge resurgence of these skills, I think, happening around the world.
Does that make you feel hopeful for? We cannot know what's going to happen, but does it at least bring some hope?
Yeah, I'm very hopeful. I think that of course, like everybody, I certainly have my moments. I have my ups and downs. With how hopeful I feel, but my sense of things is that. This planet is 4.5 billion years old, and it's been through a lot of changes.
Yes.
If we think about, the record of our planet, what things we know, the things we don't know. One thing we do know is that this planet has gone through profound transformations.
Yes.
If you think about like the dinosaurs, and all the glaciations and the different changes. So, we're going through a time of great change, but I do think that I have great hope, and I do think that many people are beginning to turn to the earth and beginning to realize that change is needed, and certainly change is happening. So,
Yes.
I think one of the things that I was hoping for with the book would be that it would inspire people to pay attention to what the earth is teaching us right now. And I think if we can watch the natural world and listen and pay attention, I think the earth will guide us. So
yeah, it's so interesting how children, I think your children and my daughter are pretty much about the same age. My daughter is 10. And so, for example, I told her when she loves in the spring to pick the flowers. So I said to her, these flowers, they're so beautiful when they're in the ground, but I do understand that you want to pick them because they're so beautiful. But maybe because I'd read somewhere, some indigenous tradition, I think from North America, that the medicine woman would pick the flower and then take a hair out of her own head and put it on the ground, like that kind of reciprocity. Like, I'm not just taking this flower for granted, I'm giving something back that kind of does, not that it hurts that much, but I'm just showing my respect. And my daughter just loves that. How children, they just intuitively feel, they intuitively know that, of course, yes, oh, that feels so good to take the hair out of my head and put it there. So if if all these schools, green schools and forest schools and all that's very hopeful.
That's such a great story. I love that. That's it right there. I think that's what that's powerful. Wow, what a profound thing for her to experience. I love that.
Yeah, and she loves it, and she's like, she comes all excited and tells me about it.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. So Micah, thank you so much. This has been really truly delightful. I mean, I just love this conversation. This is what matters so deeply to me.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me on, Dorita. It's great to meet you, and thank you for for all the wonderful work you're doing, and for sharing Rewilding with your audience. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and when you come to the Faroes, you must let me know.
Oh, I will definitely let you know.
It's a very
I can't
beautiful
wait.
place. You're gonna love it there.
I cannot wait to visit.
Yeah. So I really hope that you enjoyed this episode with Micah Mortali, and thank you so much for listening to Intimacy with the World podcast with me, Dorita Holm. And please get Micah's book. It's called Rewilding, and it's really fantastic. And there are a lot of practical practices in it. So you won't be just reading a bunch of theory. You'll actually know exactly what to do to connect with nature more deeply. So if you enjoyed this show, please be sure to subscribe to the podcast or on YouTube, and please like it and leave a comment. This helps other interested people find these inspiring conversations, and it also does help me. Thanks again, and see you all next week for a new episode.